Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliette Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. News stories are posted every month on the second Sunday at 2:30 p.m. If you enjoyed today's program, please consider liking and subscribing to our YouTube page or following our Facebook. As a reminder, some stories contain adult language and content. It is recommended you review stories before allowing younger audiences to listen.
Good morning. Today I'm going to be reading from 13 Alabama Ghosts and Jeffrey, and Jeffrey's latest 13 More Alabama Ghosts, both by Kathryn Tucker Windham. The Unquiet Ghost at Gaineswood. It is an accepted axiom which has persisted from the time of Homer to this day that no ghost can rest quietly until his body has been given proper burial. Those unfortunates who have not been interred with the necessary rites are doomed to haunt the earth until their remains are put into their graves with due ceremony. Gaineswood, the great house built in Demopolis by General Nathan B. Whitfield in 1842, has been haunted by such a reckless ghost. General Whitfield began the building of his home in 1842, and when it was complete, it was the showpiece of Alabama. His friend, George Strother Gaines, the Choctaw Indian factor, had lived on the site, and General Whitfield decided it was most fitting for the mansion to be named for him. No ghost could have found a more beautiful house to haunt than this neoclassic mansion with its 12 great Doric columns on its portico, in pleasing contrast with the more elaborate Corinthian drawing room and the priceless Chippendale furniture throughout the house. Soon after Gaineswood was completed, Mrs. Whitfield died, leaving several small children, and the general found it necessary to employ a housekeeper. He was fortunate enough to find an efficient and attractive young woman, a Miss Carter, whose father was in Europe serving as consul to Greece at the time. Miss Carter's relatives lived in Virginia, far away from the Marengo County town of Demopolis, and despite her duties as housekeeper for the large mansion and as companion for the children, she was often lonely. General Whitfield was aware of her loneliness, so being a kind and thoughtful man, he was pleased for her to invite her sister Evelyn to come to Gaineswood to spend the winter with her. Evelyn was an excellent musician and loved to play the piano. The general was also an accomplished musician, and he encouraged Evelyn to perform. He particularly liked for her to play the martial tunes of Scotland, and on occasion he would bring out his bagpipes to play duets. Together they created stirring, rousing music that filled the spacious rooms of Gaineswood and spilled over into the countryside. Evelyn's presence at Gaineswood brought happiness and cheer to the entire family. In spite of a winter of severe weather, the coldest Alabama had experienced in many, many years, life at Gaineswood was pleasant until Evelyn became sick. Although General Whitfield provided the best medical care available, after several weeks of illness, she died. Nobody remembers exactly what it was that brought about her death. Some say she had a severe attack of malaria. Others contend that it was pneumonia. And it has been rumored that she pined away because of a disappointment in love. There was a handsome young French count. He had come to Demopolis to visit his relatives among the Napoleonic exiles who settled there, who often visited Gaineswood. He appeared to be quite interested in Evelyn. It is said that he even bought an engagement ring for her, but they quarreled, and he snatched the ring, hurled it into the shrubbery, and left never to return. Evelyn's decline was attributed to the grief following this unfortunate love affair. Whatever the cause, though, Evelyn died. Because the roads were covered with ice and snow, it was impossible to have her body carried to Virginia as she had requested. Besides, it would take time for her father to return from Greece, and one of her final wishes was that he be present for her funeral. It was decided, therefore, that her burial should be postponed until spring so that her last wishes could be fulfilled. In those days, there were no embalmers anywhere near Gaineswood. To preserve her body, Evelyn's casket was placed in a heavy pine box which was sealed airtight with rosin. This box was stored under the stairs in the cellar until good weather and the return of Evelyn's father would make it possible to have a proper funeral in her own family's Virginia burying ground. As is true of all ghosts, the one thing Evelyn wanted most was to be buried so that she could rest peacefully in her own grave. She did not like being sealed in that box and kept in the cold, dark cellar. Soon after her death, the people in the house began hearing footsteps coming up the stairs from the cellar. Then they would hear the sound of tiptoes going into the drawing room where the big square piano stood. After that, faint sounds of music would float out into the hall and up the stairs into the bedrooms. Many of the tunes were those of the staunch Scottish ballads that Evelyn used to play, but the plaintive, homesick melodies of Stephen Foster were heard too. Those mournful sounds distressed the listeners, for they reminded them that Evelyn was unhappy. On the occasions when the braver members of the household would creep downstairs to investigate the source of the disturbing sounds, the music would stop abruptly, but as soon as they returned upstairs, the sad melodies would begin again. Those recurrent footsteps and the eerie music so interrupted the sleep of the family that they were greatly relieved when the weather moderated and Evelyn's body could be taken to Virginia for burial. But if the family at Gaineswood thought Evelyn's burial in Virginia would bring a complete halt to the nighttime visitations, they were mistaken. Evidently, Evelyn could not forgive them for keeping her so long under the stairs in the cellar. While her midnight wanderings were not so frequent as they had been, she did continue to return to Gaineswood occasionally. People who have spent the night at Gaineswood in recent years insist that their dreams have been interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps on the cellar stair and by the lilting, tinkling melodies of half-forgotten songs of long ago. And they are sure that the ghost of Evelyn Carter returns to protect her exile in the sealed pine box beneath the cellar stairs at Gaineswood. The Boyington Oak. In 1979, after Hurricane Frederick lashed through Mobile, destroying buildings and uprooting thousands of the city's fine old trees, many people asked, did the Boyington Oak survive? Is that old tree still standing? The Boyington Oak did withstand the furious winds of Frederick. Its deep spreading roots held fast, just as they have held against the blasts of scores of other hurricanes since the tree began to grow on the grave of Charles Boyington back in 1835. That tree, tradition has it, sprang from the young man's grave as proof that he was innocent of the murder of his friend Nathaniel Frost. As the tale has been handed down, Boyington said to the crowd gathering to watch his hanging, "I'm innocent. I did not commit the murder, and as proof of my innocence, an oak tree with 100 roots will be grown from my grave." So people watched the mound of earth that marked Boyington's burial place in Potter's Field, and strangely enough, a seedling oak began to grow there, began to spread its roots and to flourish. And the people who watched the tree's growth remembered the doomed man's prediction, and they wondered. Charles Boyington had left much to wonder about. He had no friends when he arrived in Mobile in November of 1833. He came aboard a sailing ship, but no one knows why he chose Mobile as his destination. It may have been an omen of some kind, an ill-fated omen, that Boyington arrived in Mobile the day after the stars fell on Alabama. Everywhere he went that first day in Mobile, Boyington heard excited accounts of the massive shower of meteors that had illuminated the night sky, and he heard muttered predictions that it's a bad sign. It didn't seem to be a bad sign for Boyington, not at first. With the help of a Captain Arnold, master of the ship that had brought him from New York, Boyington got a job as a printer with the firm of Pollard and Dale. He found pleasant living accommodations at a boarding house operated by Mrs. William George, and at that boarding house he found a friend, Nathaniel Frost. Frost was also a printer, and he too was a native of New England. But unlike robust Boyington, Frost was frail and sickly, suffering from tuberculosis. Boyington appeared to be sympathetic to Frost and even shared a room with him so that he, Boyington, could help Frost at night when seizures of coughing exhausted his puny strength. On balmy days when Frost felt strong enough, he was able to work only part-time. Boyington often took him for walks in fresh air. They walked slowly and rested often. Frequently they walked out to the city graveyard to read the epitaphs on the grave markers, to admire the work of the stonemasons, and to wander among the trees. If Frost became melancholy and talked of death, Boyington cheered him up by reciting a snatch of poetry or by singing a humorous song. Boyington was an unusually talented young man. Not only did he have a pleasant singing voice, he also wrote almost classical prose, composed stirring poetry, and played the lute, stringed harp, mandolin, and harpsichord as well. Those talents combined with his genteel manners and his imposing appearance, though he was only 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall, won him quick acceptance in Mobile society. Only a few weeks after his arrival in Mobile, Boyington was invited to attend a holiday ball at the Alabama Hotel, a fine building at the southeast corner of St. Francis and Royal Streets. It was at that ball that he fell in love with a young French woman, Rose de Flor, daughter of Baron de Flor. Baron de Flor had been forced to flee France following a duel in which he killed a count who had powerful social and political ties. At least that was the story that was told in Mobile. On the night of the ball, Rose de Flor wore a dress of pure silk, ivory in color, trimmed with scallops and rosettes of handmade blue lace. A late-blooming red rose, cut from the walled gardens at her home, was pinned on a cluster of curls in her deep brown hair. As she danced, her dress caught the lights from the hundreds of candles circling the ballroom, and it shimmered in a kaleidoscope of fleeting colors. Boyington somehow arranged to be her partner for dance after dance until her father frowned his disapproval, and Rose, reared to give strict and immediate obedience to her parents, danced with other young men. Before they parted, Boyington made plans to meet Rose when she went to the cathedral the next morning for early mass. Though Boyington was not Catholic, he professed to no religion. He became a faithful attendant at those early services. He found the ancient ritual beautiful and moving, but in truth, his attendance was in no way motivated by religion. Rose was there. Those meetings with Rose at Mass, she was always accompanied by a chaperone, provided Boyington a rare opportunity to be with his love. Her parents were very strict, never permitting Rose to be alone, and they discouraged visits from young suitors. So Boyington used trusted servants to slip love notes and poems to Rose, and those same servants notified him when her stern father was away from home. On those occasions when Baron de Flor was away, Boyington met Rose for clandestine strolls along Mobile's tree-shaded streets. Sometimes they walked to the city graveyard, a favorite trysting place for lovers, and sat beneath a huge tree to talk and hold hands. Always a chaperone followed them at a discreet distance. And to dream of the future. Each time they met, Boyington became more deeply in love with the French beauty. The days when he could not be with Rose were torture to Boyington. So consumed was he by his love for her that he could think of little else. He lost his appetite, and insomnia plagued his nights. During many of his sleepless nights, Boyington wrote tender poems of adoration for Rose, and on other nights he struggled to concoct some plan that would make him financially able to seek her hand in marriage. He had arrived in Mobile almost penniless, and his resources had improved only slightly since then. Boyington's fellow printers, several of whom also boarded with Mrs. George, teased him cruelly about being lovesick. He took their teasing good-naturedly, until the day when one of them found a crumpled sheet of paper on which Boyington had written a love poem to Rose. The man waited until just before mealtime, when most of the boarders, including Boyington, had gathered in the big hall to await the ringing of the dinner bell, and then in a taunting voice he read the poem aloud. The hall was filled with laughter. Boyington was enraged. He lunged toward his tormentor and would have struck him had two men not restrained him. Frost spoke sharply to him, urging him to be calm, and Boyington heeded the advice of his friend. The mild winter, so different from the bitter cold of the New England winters that both Boyington and Frost had known, drifted into spring. The spring of 1834 was lovely in Mobile. The entire city was ablaze with the fresh beauty of budding trees and flowering shrubs, a beauty so perfect and so fragile it seemed to Boyington to have been created solely as a setting for his beloved Rose. That spring, as had 10,000 springs before it, seemed to promise happiness to all lovers. But for Boyington that promise was a cruel hoax. In early April, Boyington lost his job. He had no savings, no resources, and though he tried, he could find no other work. His situation would have been desperate had his friend Frost not helped him. "Don't get so upset," Frost told him when Boyington screamed out in hopeless bitterness against his bad fortune. "You'll find a job, and until you do, I'll lend you the money to pay your room and board. The future is not as black as it appears to you right now." But the spring had lost its beauty for Boyington. He tried to hide his plight from Rose, but she sensed a change in his behavior and in his outlook, and her sympathy only deepened his humiliation and his despair. On Saturday, it was May 10th, 1834, Boyington returned to the boarding house shortly before noon, after having spent the morning in an unsuccessful effort to find a job. Frost was leaning against the banisters on the front porch whittling. The sun felt warm and good on his back. Boyington watched the skillful manipulation of Frost's knife. "You can carve almost anything, can't you?" he asked. "No, I'm actually not very good at carving, but I can make simple things. My grandfather taught me what I know. Whittling helps pass the time. It's soothing. Maybe you ought to try it," Frost replied. Boyington seemed not to hear him. "Could you carve a little wooden heart for me to give to Rose?" he asked. "Sure," Frost answered. "That will be easy. Maybe we can go to walk after dinner and I'll work on it then." So after the midday meal, Frost sharpened his knife and selected a small block of walnut from which to carve a heart. Then the two men set out for a walk. About mid-afternoon, Boyington returned to the boarding house alone. "Where's Frost?" one of the boarders asked. "He didn't get sick, did he?" "He's all right," Boyington replied. "I just had some things to attend to, so I came on ahead." He hurried to his room. A few minutes later, he handed Mrs. George a small package and asked that she have it delivered to Rose. Then he left the house. When the steamship James Monroe left Mobile, headed for Montgomery that night, Boyington was on board. The next morning, on Sunday, Frost's body was found beneath a tree near the Church Street graveyard. He had died of repeated stab wounds inflicted by a sharp knife to the heart. Monday's Mobile papers carried this official notice from Mayor John Stocking, Jr. "Murder, reward, Whereas a most atrocious murder was committed within the city of Mobile upon the body of Nathaniel Frost, and whereas suspicion rests on one Charles Boyington as the perpetrator of the horrid act, therefore I, John Stocking, Jr., Mayor of the City of Mobile, by virtue of authority in me vested by a special resolution of the Board of Aldermen, do hereby offer a reward of $250 in the event of the said Boyington being convicted of said murder. The notice of the reward was followed by a description of Boyington and the speculation that the object of the murder was likely robbery. The pockets of the deceased man had been emptied of $50 or more, and his fine gold watch was missing, the notice said. That Thursday edition of the Mobile Commercial Register and Patriot carried the announcement that Boyington had been taken into custody above the James Monroe, and was being held prisoner at Claiborne, and would be returned promptly to Mobile. A sheriff's posse, men who had chased the steamboat with Boyington aboard upriver after he fled Mobile, returned the suspect to Mobile on the steamboat Courier, arriving Friday, May 16th. He was placed immediately in the city jail. Boyington staunchly maintained his innocence, but a grand jury indicted him for the murder of Nathaniel Frost. His trial was set for November. During his months in jail awaiting trial, Boyington had several visits from Rose, who came to bring him fruit, flowers, books, and to reassure him that she believed him innocent of the horrible crime. Her visits to the jail were stopped abruptly by her father. Boyington wrote long letters to Rose in which he proclaimed his innocence and pledged his eternal love to her. He also used his time in jail to compose many poems, several of which were published in the local press. Rose may have believed that Boyington did not commit the murder, but the jury which heard the case found him guilty, and he was sentenced to die on the gallows. Though the evidence against him was purely circumstantial, it was strong enough to convict him. The execution date was set for February 20th, 1835. Even after the trial, Boyington continued to declare his innocence. His spiritual advisor, Dr. William T. Hamilton, pastor of the Presbyterian Church, urged Boyington to prepare for eternity by speaking the truth of his actions, but Boyington refused to confess to a crime which he swore he did not commit. He appealed to Governor John Gale to spare his life, but the governor declined to intervene in the case. On the day of the scheduled execution, Mobile streets were filled with people who had come to witness the hanging. They lined the streets from the jail on St. Emmanuel Street, out to the present Washington Square where the gallows had been built. Whether by accident or design, the route that Boyington's death procession would follow led past the spot where Frost was slain. It was the custom in those days for the condemned man to ride to his execution seated on his coffin. However, an exception was made in Boyington's case, and he was permitted to walk behind the cart that bore his coffin. Dr. Hamilton walked beside him. Boyington was dressed in a plain black suit, and he wore a high silk hat which he doffed to friends whom he recognized in the crowds along the streets. He walked in cadence to the music of the brass band leading the procession, and his expression did not change until he first saw the waiting gallows. He quickly regained his composure, mounted the platform, and began to read a lengthy prepared statement setting forth his innocence. When the sheriff ordered a halt to this delaying tactic, Boyden uttered his now famous prediction about the oak tree that would grow from his grave as proof of his innocence. The hanging, witnesses recorded, was gruesome, terribly botched by inexperienced hangmen and by a prisoner who struggled for his life. The event was marked by unusual incidents. As Dr. Hamilton was speaking the last words of comfort to Boyington, Sheriff Tommelman walked over to greet a friend who was sitting on a log near the gallows. Suddenly, Sheriff Tommelman fainted, and so did his friend. At the same instant, the sheriff's horse collapsed in his harness. Boyington used the confusion resulting from these faintings to make one final effort to free himself from the noose, but his struggle was useless. After about a half hour, his body was cut down and nailed in his coffin. He was buried in the northwest corner of Potter's Field at the Church Street graveyard. His grave was near the wall on Bayou Street and only about 60 yards from the place where Frost was slain. Shortly after he was buried, a tiny oak seedling sprouted out of his grave. Hundreds of people came to look at the seedling and to wonder if it indeed was a sign of Boyington's innocence. Friends of Frost placed a marker on Boyington's grave, a marker that read, Charles R. S. Boyington, hanged for the murder of Nathaniel Frost, February 20th, 1835. That marble marker disappeared long ago. No visible sign of the grave remains. The area was cleared for use as a playground years ago and is now used unofficially for parking. But the oak, a strong tree with 100 deep roots that grew from Boyington's grave, still stands. Visitors to the spot who listen as bay breezes rustle the leaves of that massive oak hear a repeated refrain. I'm innocent, innocent, innocent. The locket. None of his descendants now knows why Jacob Hammer left his native Indiana and moved to Alabama. They do know from records in family Bibles that Jacob Hammer was living in Talladega County when he married Martha Louisa Hicks of Renfro on December 1st, 1887. He was 34 at the time of their marriage, and his bride was 21. Mr. Hammer had taught school and had been engaged in merchandising in Indiana, and family tradition says he taught school, ran a store, and farmed after he came to Alabama. In the first 6 years of their marriage, 5 children were born to the couple: Cassandra, William Benjamin, Emma Everett, Diana, and Dixie Homer. Some of the children's names, family members point out, reflect Mr. Hammer's interest in Greek and Roman mythology. He was interested in many things. He wanted to call his first child by her full name, Cassandra, but his wife, who cared little for the classics, insisted on calling her Cassie, and Cassie she became. Cassie was 9 years old when her baby brother Harvey was born. She was a big girl then, old enough and responsible enough to take over much of the care of the new baby. Being the oldest in the family, and being a girl, Cassie at 9 knew how to cook, clean house, wash clothes, iron, milk the cow, kill and dress a chicken, sew, mend and darn, and take care of the younger children. They were living in the community of Stemley, near the Coosa River in Talladega County then. All the children from Cassie to Harvey were born there, but the town has now dwindled into nothingness, and only a few people remember where it was. Cassie Hammer was likely too busy helping her mother care for the younger children, especially the baby, to have much time to play, but she really didn't mind. There was something different about taking care of Harvey, something that soothed her resentment over having the responsibilities of a grown-up forced so early upon her. Harvey was a good baby, and he was beautiful. "Look, Mama," Cassie would say after she had bathed and dressed him. "Look how beautiful Harvey is. I wish I had curly hair like he has. Look how it shines in the sunlight, and look how big his eyes are. Sometimes I think he sees things we can't see. What do you suppose he sees, Mama?" Mrs. Hammer, being a sensible woman, replied, "Don't be silly, Cassie. He sees just what we see, nothing else." She paused. "But he is a beautiful baby. I wish I could have his picture made looking just the way he looks now, all clean and shining and happy." She took the baby in her arms and kissed him. It was not easy for Mrs. Hammer to show affection. It wasn't her nature. But Harvey had a quality, an elusive quality that even his mother couldn't define, that called her to hug him and cuddle him and call him my precious baby. Everybody loved Harvey. They loved him not merely because he was the youngest in the family, but because Harvey himself was so loving. His arms went out to everyone who came near. His smile had a radiance of pure joy, and his laughter was as musical and refreshing as snatches of dancing tunes. Even Jacob Hammer, usually too busy earning a living for his growing family to squander time in play, would bounce his baby on his knee and sing to him some half-forgotten songs from his Indiana boyhood, and talk to him about matters that only the two of them understood. "You know what?" Jacob asked his wife. "That son of ours will grow up to see flying machines carrying passengers and mail from city to city, and he'll ride on wide thoroughfares connecting the cities. Big changes are coming in this world, and Harvey will be a part of them." "Oh, Jacob," Miss Hammer replied, "what a wild imagination you have. How do you ever think of such foolish things?" "They're not foolish," Jacob stated firmly. "They'll come true. You'll see if you live long enough. Harvey believes what I'm telling you, don't you, Harvey?" The baby smiled, and his eyes shone as though he did indeed understand, as though he shared with his father an exciting look into the future. Harvey was walking and beginning to talk a little when the family moved to Renfro, a community some 6 miles west of Talladega. At that time, Mr. Hammer was devoting most of his energies to farming. Cassie continued to be Harvey's loving protector, and the toddler adored her. Mrs. Hammer may have been a little jealous, but she tried not to show it. "I hope your own babies will love you as much as Harvey does," she says to Cassie one day. "He loves you too, Mama," Cassie replied. "He loves everybody but you most of all. Sometimes," she added, "I think it's not me, but my gold locket that Harvey loves. He plays with it every time I wear it, and I believe he wants to wear it himself." Cassie's locket, her only piece of jewelry, had been a gift from her father. It was a heart-shaped and hung on a slender gold chain. "It looks like you," Jacob Hammer had said as he fastened it around her neck. "It looks like my Cassandra." Even then, Harvey reached out to get the shining locket. "No, Harvey," Cassie said gently. "Boys don't wear lockets. This is mine. Maybe sometime I'll let you try it on, but not now." One stormy night in late September 1898, Cassie woke up and heard Harvey crying in her parents' bedroom. She ran across the hall and found her mother holding Harvey in her lap while Mr. Hammer rubbed the little boy's chest with melted tallow and wrapped a flannel cloth around him. "It's the croup," Mrs. Hammer told Cassie. "He's really sick." She held the baby close and rocked him. Harvey was limp and listless, and his breathing was raspy. "What can I do?" Cassie asked. "Nothing," Mrs. Hammer replied. "We've done all we can. Now we will just have to wait." Just as daylight marked the end of that long night, Harvey Hammer died. He was 20 months old. When word of the child's death spread through the community, the neighbors came, as they always came in the rural South. They were silent with grief, some of them, while others tried to speak comforting about understanding someday and God's will. Jacob Hammer did not believe it was God's will for Harvey to die. Neither did Cassie. The younger children walked around the house big-eyed and frightened until an aunt came to take them home with her. Mrs. Hammer's grief was too deep for tears. "My baby, my precious baby," she kept repeating. "He's dead and we don't even have a picture of him. We never had a picture made of our precious Harvey." Mr. Hammer, hoping to ease his wife's sorrow, promised, We'll send in to Talladega and get the photographer to come out and take Harvey's picture in his coffin. Then you, and all of us, will have his picture to remember him by." Outside, a cold slashing rain seemed almost an extension of the gloominess of the household. Men who lived nearby fashioned a small coffin from pine boards, and the women padded it with cotton and lined it with a soft white cloth. Those same neighbor women made a little dress for Harvey to be buried in. It was white, as befitted a burial garment for a pure child, and it had a wide, ruffled, lace-trimmed collar. When they put the garment on him, the neck was too big, making the collar hang low on his pale shoulders. "That will be all right," one of the women said. "When we put him in the coffin, we'll just pull the collar in place and tuck the extra under him." And they did. After Harvey's body was placed in the coffin, and after the seamstresses had pulled up the collar and tucked it beneath him, nobody could tell the neck was too large. "He looks so peaceful," the people said, "just like he was asleep." "Come look at your little brother, Cassie," they said. Cassie looked. She knew the women were expecting her to say something, but she couldn't make any words come. She stood there silent for a long time, just looking at Harvey and wondering what it was like to be dead. Then, very slowly, she took off her heart-shaped locket and fastened it around Harvey's neck. The rain never slacked. Finally, word came that the roads between Talladega and Renfrew were impassable, so the photographer couldn't come. Harvey Hammer was buried without ever having had his picture made. His mother continued to grieve, as did other members of the family, and she continued to weep over having no picture of her little boy. "If only I had his picture to look at, to remember him by," she moaned. A few weeks after Harvey's death, Mr. Hammer set out to clear a parcel of land some distance from his house. The land was too far away for him to come and go each day, so he made arrangements to camp in an abandoned one-room schoolhouse near the property. The building had a pot-bellied stove in it that he could use for heat and for cooking, so Mr. Hammer took a cot to sleep on, blankets, some food, and moved into the school. The first night there he was tired from the move and from the strenuous labor of clearing the land, and he fell asleep soon after he had eaten supper. He had been asleep for some time when he was awakened by a brilliant light. His first thought was that the building was on fire, and he jumped up to run outside. But as soon as he was fully awake, he realized that the building was not on fire. The light came from the corner of the room. In the corner was his little boy Harvey, holding a burning candle. Jacob Hammer walked towards the figure and reached out towards him. As he did, the child blew out the candle and vanished. There was no more sleep for Jacob Hammer that night. Questions crowded in upon him. Had he really seen his son, or was his grief conjuring up cruel visions? Could Harvey have returned from the dead? And if so, why? The daylight brought no answers, and the questions haunted him all the next day as he worked in his field. That second night, the same thing happened. He was awakened by a flash of light and saw Harvey holding a flickering candle in the corner of the room. Once again, Jacob Hammer approached the child, and once again the child blew out the candle and vanished. As Jacob Hammer lay awake and tried to answer the questions that trampled through his mind, a new thought came to him. Was it possible, he wondered, that Harvey's spirit was so disturbed by his mother's yearning for a picture of him that he had come back so that such a picture could be made? The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced of the logic of his theory. So when daylight came, instead of going to his field, Jacob Hammer went to Talladega to borrow a camera from W.H. McMillan, a photographer there. He did not tell Mr. McMillan why he wanted to use the camera. He would have felt foolish saying he intended to try and photograph a ghost, so he implied that he needed a picture of a landmark on his property, and he promised to return the camera early the next morning. Mr. McMillan let him borrow one of the cumbersome old cameras with a tripod, and he showed him how to use it. "Be careful with the glass negative," he warned. "They break right easy." Jacob Hammer took the equipment back to the school building and set it up beside his cot, focusing it on the corner where he had seen the apparition on the 2 previous nights. He did not go to sleep that night. He sat on the side of the cot and waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Mr. Hammer was beginning to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing, when suddenly a bright light filled the room and he saw Harvey in the far corner. He snapped the shutter of the camera and the figure disappeared. Mr. Hammer dozed fitfully, as he was very tired, until daylight came. Then he went to Talladega to return the camera and have the glass plate developed. Once again he wondered what he should tell the photographer, and once again he decided to tell him nothing. After he had thanked the man for the use of his camera, he asked, "Will you please develop the plate? I took only one picture, but I would very much like to see it." Jacob Hammer waited, a restless wait, until Mr. McMillan came out of the dark room. He was holding the glass negative, still wet, up to the light. "Jacob," he said, "I thought you did not have a picture of your little boy, the one who died." "We don't have," Jacob Hammer replied. "Yes, you do. This is him, Harvey, right here, look." Jacob Hammer looked. On the negative was the exact likeness of Harvey Hammer. Blonde curls, big eyes, wistful smile framed in a strange aura of light. Jacob Hammer was unable to speak. He took the negative from the hands of the puzzled photographer and hastened home. "Martha! Martha!" he shouted as he ran into the house. "Look!" He held the glass negative up to the light. Martha Hammer looked and burst into sobs. "It's Harvey! It's my baby's picture!" Cassie and the other children came running to see what was happening. "It's Harvey," they said. "Harvey, just like he looked." "And look," Cassie said. "Look how his dress has fallen around his shoulders. And look around his neck. That's my heart-shaped locket, the one that I put on him." After the family had seen the negative with the likeness of Harvey on it, and after he had told the story of how he had made the picture, Jacob Hammer took the glass plate back to the photographer in Talladega to have prints made from it. 3 of those prints made in the fall of 1898 still exist. Each one, though faded by time, shows quite distinctly the head and shoulders of a beautiful blonde child with wandering eyes who seemed to peer into another world. The lace-trimmed collar of his white garment has slipped down his shoulders, and round his neck hangs a gold heart-shaped locket.